Hello everyone, today I talk about something that I hope will not sadden you enough, but I think it's important, something that I wanted to discuss at some point, that I thought I would leave mostly for when I will reveal a bit more about, my background, but not because of myself, but rather for talking, in fact, about things that happened in my family in the past, in certain historical moments that I think are stories that we can share together, and that honestly, ever since I was little, I was very fascinated from. Today, it's not a great day for me because my grandmother passed away, and she was my last grandparent. She was very old, and the tragic side of it is just that unfortunately, it seems we are all sick in the family with what may easily be coronavirus. I feel well. I have had some symptom, recently. My parents do not feel so good, but also, thank God now that they're stable. And therefore, today I didn't have much, interest to talk, even though it's a way of venting a bit for everything, as every day, honestly, not just because of today. And I don't really want to say anything special, but something that can maybe serve for our historical interest at some level. That is to consider, in fact, the value of our families, of our origins, of what we know of the past, which, as you know, is something that, as I often said on Schwerpunkt, is um, you know, to me, an ever greater problem than it's been in the past, right? We there is probably an historical problem of our times that is rooted to this, and uh, that is essentially the concrete, the practical benefit that we can get from knowing the past. Knowing the past broadly meant, as you know, from a philosophical as well as a gnosiological um, you know, realization, we do live in the past, right? Our realization of what happens around us is physically already past, right? Like everything, as everything must pass. Um, so what we are doing in our lives is to be researchers, right? To be properly historians in the truest sense of the word. That is to sort out what happens, why, and this can be helpful in many ways that I don't need to remind you, right? When I was younger, I wasn't so thrilled by the idea that history is really, a master of life, teacher of life. I liked very much the idea. I liked very much also the Latin motto stemming from it. I didn't like it mostly, actually, as a reaction, because as you know, I'm a bit polemical after all. Um, to the easy cliche that fundamentally history repeats itself, and that therefore, as a consequence, some people at least, tend to feel legitimized to say, all seen, all we know how it's gonna go, which is to me a highly irresponsible thing because it equates fundamentally to say that it's an extremely superficial and approximate realization. There's never been a single thing in history that has repeated itself, right? There are similar things, of course, that happen, but in contexts that are ever changing and with causes that are ever changing in a way. So it's obvious that it's somewhat easy and natural to find some patterns of interpretation. That is exactly what we use to teach history, uh, didactic for the sake of didactically. But the next stage, right? That is what go that goes beyond what you can learn in school, or maybe even you get the basics in a higher education, is hopefully, and this can be gotten by anyone, right? You don't need to be a historian, you don't need to be an expert, but it's properly the idea that the purpose of history, excuse me, is research in itself, right? And it never ends because objectively there is nothing about history that you can't stop saying, okay, that's all we know, right? And therefore, there is no other consideration that we can spend on it. So today, it came into my mind, en passant, um, and with the obvious memories of the loss, um, the mm, the realization of the generational um, gaps. I mean, the distance that, of course, exists with our parents, with our grandparents, and beyond. My family, we have fairly distant generations. My grandmother was very old. She was born in 1923. Think about it. Incidentally, in the tragicity of it, in the same, years after, I think the Spanish flu had already finished, but I mean, this, lifespan spent into this two great pandemics, she had a good life, more than good life, I would say. I was attached to her, of course, as you can imagine, and she also was, I don't know. It's not that I cared overwhelmingly, but I don't know. It was the noble branch of my family as well. She was a countess by family, and my grandfather that passed away more than 10 years ago. Yeah, was even older, way older, right? And so these were people of other times in a way, and of course the distance is also felt. Unfortunately, my grandmother wasn't. She didn't even recognize from some years on, because with age, she was of course conscious, etc. But you feel that the person is passing from the moment in which you already don't see it's the person it was before. It doesn't recognize you. But of course, I cared, and I was close to her. And this day made me think objectively that yes, I've lost that generation, because all my other grandparents, unfortunately, also are gone. Uh, and I speak of this specifically for a reason, that is to say that they all had a deep, aside from the familial relation, they all had a deep historical importance for me. Right? It's not because I considered the person as a monument, but maybe. But surely they lived in harsh times of our lives, mainly World War II. My paternal grandfather, even, but also the first when they were little, right? So this tells you actually how distant they were from me. I say it historically also because from my maternal grandfather, that is the only one that I never met, because actually died 4 years before I was born. It's something that saddens me dramatically, but I love the person as much as if I had known him in person. Really, he was the one that basically passed down his historical interest, right, to me. And others, also my grandmother, actually told me a lot about history, etc. But mostly she told me about things. I mean, she was a girl during World War II, as you understand. That's where she met my grandfather, who was a medical officer that also hid during the deportations on a mountain. She basically went every day for tens of kilometers on foot, reaching the mountain to bring food for my grandfather. That spent, he ate grass and also had frozen feet. So they told me that they were running across the country while the Allies were bombing from one side, the Germans from the other, and she had her house actually shattered by bomb, because the door, the windows exploded. Fortunately, not destroying the house. So these were all memories, plus others, of course, all mixed together, that deeply impressed me. Right. Also, for example, my grandfather saved my grandmother's brother's life during World War II. This is another thing that makes you think, because these were all people that risked deeply my life. My grandfather hid in a ditch, while a few meters from him there were people getting gunned down, being executed. He That was an airplane bomb that actually exploded very close to him. He was shocked for days. They couldn't even stand on his feet, but even there. So a few meters, and I would have not existed. An entire life. My parents it all would have been different. And this is to me the value of history. I remember when I was a child, and they told me about these stories. I found them deeply interesting, and I also maintained a deep interest towards those times. That also, when I was a bit older, I began to evaluate deeply, also from a lot of other points of view. For example, war, as you know, it's something that interested me ever since I was a child. But understanding, what we also discussed about the political, civic, democratic values and responsibilities, that's something that I began to understand it, and later studying history. And then at a certain point, you realize, well, your grandparents were there. And they lived throughout all that. And it's not even a long time ago, because time is dramatically fast, right? Everything passes with an incredible speed. So it's not a long time ago. And today I was thinking specifically about another aspect of this story. That is, we often make on Schwerpunkt, and I hope that you kind of like the thing, not much of an evidential history of our topics, but rather, looking at the thing in perspective and fundamentally highlighting the difficulties that we have from a probably mental point of view to understand what the people at the time really thought and acted like, which is something that, I'm talking about chiefly the Middle Ages. That is what we discussed the most, but generationally speaking, I think all of you has a pretty good understanding of what it means to talk with a person that has another mindset. You realize it even with your parents. It can be even with your siblings if they, I don't know, they lived for years in another country, or that this is, to me, is mostly evident for my grandparents, that obviously had a mindset that was very different from the one already of my parents and my own. And that's also fascinating. And there is one aspect of it that is not necessarily, amazing or mind-blowing, but really makes you reflect a lot on the also the lack, in part, that we still have in our generations to live in a time of a very quick transition. The 20th century especially has been, even the 21st, of course, but the 20th century has been really basically the single most accelerated time in terms of political and social change in the history of the world up to our own days in the 21st. And therefore, in many ways, a bit like, I was grown old with paper and pencil most, right? It just seems strange because you say, but, in a Western country, well, yes, but, we didn't use much the computer. We were, fine with the thing up to a certain age. I came relatively late to be, informatized, digital. But and already that, for example, is an exception, right? We will not have the same thing, historically speaking. I mean, the generations of the past were unique in their own kind, the one of the future in the same way. But we are experiencing right now, with our life and with the memory of our older relatives, a gap, a distance that historically has never produced itself generationally from a mental point of view. And I suspect that this is terribly educational. Sometimes I look at this, I have younger relatives, like they go from, they're mostly, either teenagers or children, right? So I get the whole spectrum of what's the new generation like. And it strikes me, obviously, and for many of you probably it's already normal, right? Because I'm young, but not so young anymore, to have grown old immediately with social network, the digital world as basically the only thing that is out there, the only function, the only exercise, the only mental horizon in a way or another. And is not the time nor the space for now talking about this, because I've never, expanded excessively on. I sound like an old person that criticizes all the new things, but I do see obviously a very positive value in some changes, but also I realize the loss of others. And definitely, there is that saying that says that when an old person dies, it's as if, a library burned down to ashes. It is true, indeed. And I will not tell you what sounds banal, especially from this situation, that is, spend more time with your grandparents, know them before they leave you at some point, because it's obvious that it's something that we all understand. Even when I was a child, I objectively, being acquainted with death, with losses, etc., I realized the importance of knowing your relatives, all of them, right? Probably even more important for yourself as a person, it's your parents, right? Not all parents talk very much about themselves, about the when they were young. There are not because maybe they're not talkative or open about it, but necessarily because maybe they don't. In fact, they have never thought, as you may have never thought, to ask them more, right? My parents also have lost at this point their parents, and they often say, aside from the missing them, they often say, like, I wish I had asked them so many things that are fundamentally biographical, right? It's not, if you loved me or not, because then, it's bad. Of course, there are unfortunately situations in which parents and grandparents can be also perfect jerks, but, that's another thing. But it's mostly like, what did you do there? Like, they have some, my grandparents had way more, even important lives, and objectively, nor me, nor my cousins, nor my parents have asked them more than much about certain aspects. So that is, I want at some point to go out to make some research in some archive, in the military, in the genealogies, in the parishes, and so on, because I'm thoroughly interested. Then, of course, there is also the genealogical interest, which is very fascinating. Some of you ask me sometimes. I said, "But how far can you trace back your family?" From my paternal side up to basically the late 17th century, for real, right? Not the bullshit that you those sites that you descend from Charlemagne or from Romania. Those are all crap. And frankly, I don't know how many people actually even believe that the aside from the imaginific knowledge of what the sources are, how are they so arrogant to even pretend that we know that specific person at the end of the day descended from, and they all have this dramatic ancestors, and they don't even question the value of the sources of the research, or unless you are royalty or certain families that you perfectly know, look, that person descended from that king, and that we know more or less. But aside from the various illegitimate sons, natural sons, let's say, and the objective historical difficulties that we have, the best way to know your ancestors is actually to know history. And this is something, in fact, that, as we were saying before, happened to me also from my grandparents. Like today, I look at my grandparents in a very different way than I did 10 years ago, when I knew objectively less even about the 20th century, about certain aspects of this, because it became clearer to me that this is what history does, is shedding light and actually clarifying certain connections, certain behaviors, certain ideologies, certain phraseologies. This is very easy to do. I always do it with my parents. But the value, as you understand in here, is exactly getting acquainted to this research, and especially to the concept that aside from the respect for the old, which is something that I personally do not have properly. I personally estimate just intelligent people, right? I don't care whatever age, sex you are. Maybe with children, just I can say those are children, so they're not mature, so you can excuse them for maybe sometimes being the way they are. Uh, but with adults, I do not. I respect all intelligence, but let's say a bit of understanding, right? The idea that that person was born in a certain context, was brought up like that, and used to have those beliefs. Um, Maybe some were wrong, some were something unacceptable even for today's standards, but that is a historical source. That is an historical evidence, and that's something that, in fact, gets you used to become critically skilled, right? To 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 realize at some point it's like an epiphany, right? That can strike you even in your own life. Starting from your own life. For example, the way you used to think. I don't know if you ever kept a diary in your lives. I used to, for a while, and now I don't. I updated it just rarely, but it's useful because when you read it, you say, that's what I was thinking. Like, that's what was pushing me. That's what my rationale was. That's what my feelings were, and that at some point strikes you, because sometimes you realize quite clearly, even just from yourself, that what existed in the past in that way was not. It is comparable, right? We can compare certain things in the past, but it's exactly the comparison that sometimes shows you how it's all very contingental. That is to say, also the improvement of civilization, that doesn't necessarily mean that the person that existed 1,000 years ago was less of you because of that. Now, we have taken a bit this. I think it's a rightful way of looking at history also in moral terms by certain standards. I'm not really against the idea of it, but sometimes we completely lack from that perspective the historical process, because it's just a moral judgment and not a historical understanding of what was like, right? I remember, for example, that this banal, maybe nothing to do even with this today's topic, but I remember once I was coming back home from university, and I with a motorcycle, and I stopped by my old high school, which is also a beautiful place in my city. That it's an historical building. It has it's beautiful, a nice architecture all around in the square, in the street, beautiful palaces around, etc. And I stopped there after many years that I had finished school, and that I had not passed by those places anymore. So that in my mind I had this memory, right, of that was of course a bit blurred at that point after some year of what that past had been, right? When it's about you can understand better the difference in time, because with the generational gap, you also do not properly understand much because you were not the same person, right? You can't talk with the person. They can mean a lot to you. You can sympathize a lot with them, but it's not the same thing of leaving them. You cannot understand what it means to live under a bombardment if you've never done it, if you read it from the distance. You can guess it, but the feelings, which are what truly matters, the emotions, the moral dimension of it, broadly net, is truly what eventually dictates certain aspects. And I remember I stopped by the place when I used to, chat with my classmates before entering school, and I stopped there. It was silent. It was towards the evening. There was no one, and I stopped thinking, and just the sight of those trees, of those gates, those gardens, those houses, brought me back emotionally to those times. And in the meanwhile, in those years, I had actually grown up a lot intellectually. Right, I presumed arrogantly that I had become better than I was before. It was probably true at some level. At the time, I still hadn't quite pictured the thing. It was a bit more morally relativistic. But it struck me like lightning at that point. Then it came back into my mind the enormous moral effort that I made at the time for getting my grades right, to getting the good marks, studying every day, getting there every day, right? At university, you don't go very often. At least I didn't. Also because I could avoid it, and I never liked it, honestly. Prefer way more to study alone. And I remember all this, let's say, set of difficulties, of anxieties, of thoughts, of worries, and of spirit, of great spirit, of something new that objectively, when you are younger, it's stronger, right? When you are an adolescent, you do feel emotions in a much stronger way. And in a way, it's also how people used to live in the past, right? When they were less, intellectually, rationally developed, people lived and felt things like love, death, joy, sadness in a much stronger, much more genuine way that we do. We know it's a real thing psychologically, so it can help to understand history in the past. And therefore, at that point, I realized that it's as if that was the warrior me, and after I had become, the secular, the modernized soldier in the meanwhile, right? That doesn't make that enormous individual effort anymore like the warrior does, but becomes much more effective because it has much more instruments and tools and capacities to literally make economy of energies to invest somewhere else, right? That's civilization, that's rationale, that's properly what the intelligence of it is, in my opinion. That's how I read civilization. But it struck me because I realized that what I was before, from an individual point of view, even if I accomplished less, because I was less intelligent, I was less capable, and also I properly obtained less as a high school student than I did when I was a university student. I was a kid. But I realized how stronger, from an individual point of view, I was emotionally, how much moral force I could put, and how now I had gotten fundamentally lazier, less pressured, right? More confident about the fact that things would go better with less effort and more capacity. But that made me lazier, made me less strong. And this is just for something so banal as, aging, in the 21st century as a kid, as a young person. You can imagine what it means for a person like my grandmother has been to live through things like the most devastating conflict in the history of humanity, to have seen the face of war and of death and of destruction and of fear of death. Fear when they bomb your house, right? That is not, and to have seen it all before in a way, and to and think of what perspective there could be there. Surely these were people that also owned very different, that also missed something compared to what eventually, I don't know, these were already adults at that point. But of course, today we got something else. But the involvement, also the properly the moral distinction, capacity to understand what it means to risk life, what it means to help someone, what it means to make a sacrifice. This is something that we do not know very much anymore. At least it happens, of course, to many, but it's never as hard, as dramatic as it was before, right? And it's possible that at the time, I don't know, people even cared less in a way. It was easier to die than today. it was, life was poorer. There was, but all this shaped those minds in a way that for us maybe it's not understandable in the same way it was to them. Right? I've never believed, for example, that a person that lived in those times actually understood what those times really were. I'm just saying that those people lived certain perspectives, certain experiences, certain emotions that we cannot know up to that point. So, for example, surely I can't say, I don't know, that I know World War II much better than my grandparents did. People that lived and even fought in it. So, that doesn't mean that I know what it means to be under a shelling or to look at people killing each other. That I do not know. But I do know, broadly speaking, what they were doing there. Because if you were under fascism or communism, but you were an ignorant, and that's it fundamentally. You didn't understand what the world was at the time. You were prevented actively from knowing. And especially education didn't help you very much in that regard. And way less people were educated just by default, even in democratic countries and so it was all a different thing. Having said this, this is the advice I can give. That is, we have this great fortune of knowing, of having known people that are mentally much more distant from us, very closely, like in our families. In the next generations, probably there will not be a dramatic acceleration as there has been in the past, right? Lots of things will change. It will be very different. We will always be different, and perhaps, I don't know, maybe we will detach ourselves further in that regard. But remember that the people that we have known in our families come from a world that is intrinsically different. In a world where, I don't know, the majority of the people still lived in the countryside, for example, at least in certain circumstances, that didn't know much of mass means of communication, that lived with certain standards of material wealth. Of course, were very different, I don't know, already from the time of the 19th century, the 18th century, but that were reversed in many ways on our own, and especially in the way of thinking, and especially what we often talked about, that is properly the concept that 100 years ago, most people, the overwhelming majority of people, were fundamentally just practically minded and not theoretically minded. Today, the trend has inverted. The overwhelming majority of people is educated to be theoretically minded, and a very few are practically minded. This obviously because of the expansion of means of communication, for the importance of the tertiary. It's obvious that the majority of people were just working in an industry, or they were peasants at the time. They had to be practically oriented, right? Practically minded. Today it's not like that anymore, because most people work fundamentally in the field, in the tertiary field, right? So they have to think mostly in an organizational sense, abstracting, doing something. So this thing surely will not change in the future, right? At least it's unlikely to happen. And for generations and generations to come, we will not meet people that like our grandparents, that were, for example, practically minded, and practically in very heavy ways, also physically. These were tough people who were more resistant, even just physically speaking, than us, or habituated at least to more exertions than we are today. And they had they are a model. They are what remains of a world that has been the real world since the dawn of mankind up to the 20th century, right? So, as historians, I think of these specific generations, we have the privilege of having known the last of those kind, which are, at the end of the day, ourselves. It's our blood, it's our relatives, it's our parents, it's our grandparents, right? And this is something that for maybe in the future, I don't know, we'll not see for who knows how much. And our children, our grandchildren will not know, right? And that we will have also the responsibility of telling them how they were, and not to let them forget it, because objectively something that really hurts me is to see how also for educational problems the younger generations by their own parents, so they can be us or our people from that were born just a few time before us, do not even care to tell them that they came from that past, or were at least brought up by people that were of that kind, that different kind. We would say, they were just different, but they will not tell them, unfortunately, how truly different and how and why they were so different, right? So, that was my advice and my reflection. I don't think I mean, there are lots of things I could add, but I think I will stop it here. So I spent this very humble and unworthy tribute to my grandparents that unfortunately now have all left me, and that I've loved greatly, and that have yet taught me so much, and to whom we all owe so much. So naturally, this was a very modest and unworthy tribute to my grandmother and to my grandparents, and I think we all owe them very much, don't we? Think about your grandparents, right? If you can, just ask them lots of things. Know them, know who they are, as long as you can, and even if they're past and you want to cherish their memory, I think it's a positive, it's an intelligence, it's a good thing to try to know, in fact, more about them, also through people that have known them, like your parents, but also going to look, I don't know, at old photos and trying to maybe reconstruct their lives, what they did, what they were. And believe me, there is always something new. There is always something new that amazes us, that, it's like a puzzle, like you missed that piece and you say, oh wow, this is what it was, and before I didn't know, and that was my grandparent, right? That eventually is the person that made my family at some point, that transmitted to me something that I suppose is a baggage, is a treasure, something that from that past that is gone, and that I have to carry over my shoulders, which is a burden but a privilege of doing. And this is, in my opinion, also why we have to learn history, because without the people that made it history, we wouldn't be. So I will close this video with a great thank to our grandparents, and for now I just hope that you're having a good time in spite of the current situation. I will keep making these videos, and I don't know if these are naturally things can always get worse, right? And I probably really got sick, but fortunately for now I feel well and I can keep doing these videos. And in case, I will tell you if I stop for some reason. And I just wish you a great time and see you next time. Bye.